Allows me or Amazon or whoever to order copies as their as people want to buy them, but they look like regular books. This is what the paperback looks like. I struggled with the intended audience. At one point I thought it would be for young adults, but as there are some main characters that aren't young adults, it seemed like it was more appropriate to target it to a general audience. But certainly people who are interested in local history are going to be the primary audience for the book.
Available for purchase today, and Deb will sign copies of it.
Yes.
She has degrees from St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, and from the University of Maine School of Law. She is a board member with the Olympia Historical Society, a member of the Pacific Northwest Writers Association. She lives in Olympia with her husband and teenage son, so welcome.
Things that need to be different.
Because I was writing about a largely unknown family, I found that these resources that I've talked about were very, very useful because everybody's required to file certain documents with their tax authority or whatever, and so you're always going to find. I shouldn't say always. I'd say there are some communities, for example, Native American communities and possibly some other Chinese community, for example, where for example, the census taker barely bothered to figure out what their names were. And so that's going to be a lot more challenging than somebody who's a Euro-American, who at least, you can kind of try to figure out how you're going to spell Schneider, and it's easier for somebody to find their name. But yeah, I imagine there's some communities where it's going to be much, much harder. Woman is researching a story about an escaped slave who lived here, and she has a hard time finding any kind of documents about even his existence, except for the fact that he escaped and was in the newspaper for that reason. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Schneider Creek. It's on the campus of the Evergreen State College, and it runs into Schneider Cove. And they're doing some restoration work there for fish access, which is where I first read about it. I'm not 100% sure it was named after the Schneiders, but as August Schneider lived on that property, and as nobody else at Evergreen seems to have any different idea, I'm assuming that it was named after August Schneider. In addition to the three Schneider Creeks, there's Schneider Hill and Schneider Avenue, which is down at the end of West Bay Drive, right where that's the one at the left that goes up the hill. There's a prairie. Many of you know about Schneider's Prairie, or Schneider Prairie as it's known now, and there's little spots of it that still look like prairie. A lot of it is developed yet. And finally, and Shannon knows about this, there is the Schneider Oak, which is a listed tree. It's up near the intersection of Steamboat Island Road and 101, and it marks the demarcation of property lines, and is an important historical living object that we have in our community. So this would give you an idea of the extent of the land ownings that the Schneider family had at one time. At one time, they were probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, landowning families in Thurston County. But I didn't know about any of this when I first got interested in the Schneider family. I'm an indexer, as Shanna mentioned, for the Washington State Library. They're putting their territorial newspapers up online. And what that means is they scan the newspapers and they put them up on the internet, and there's a cadre of volunteers that go in and they read every single article of these newspapers and index them by persons' names, keywords, subject matter, title, and so forth. It's a wonderful hobby for somebody like me who's been interested in biography and history all of my life. When you start reading newspapers, you realize that you're living in a different pace than if you read a history or biography. History is about a big period of time or big geographic area. A biography is about a lifespan, but a newspaper is about day-to-day life. And people like to read online newspapers for all kinds of reasons. And I might ask you, what might you want to read a territorial newspaper for? What might you be looking for? Very good. Yeah, that's number one. Names. So we sometimes run across articles that are just lists of names, sometimes 4 columns of them, and we index every single one. And it's pretty boring for us, but it's wonderful if you're looking for somebody. And this one was a list of dead letters. It was in the Olympia Pioneer and Democrat, and I indexed it. And then later on, when I was looking for a particular name, lo and behold, it came up. And you probably can't see it, but it is Isaac Rosenheim had 2 dead letters waiting for him. And the fact that Isaac Rosenheim had 2 dead letters waiting for him at this particular time plays a small but interesting episode in the course of my book, Conrad and Albertina. So what might be some other reasons somebody might look at old newspapers? Social values or events that are happening in people's lives. This is one of the first ones that I indexed back when I started over 5 years ago. It was a Spokane paper. And the title is VVV, Vim Vigor Villard. And it has to do with the fact that the Northern Pacific Railroad had been completed, was coming through Washington State, and the city of Spokane was going to come out and celebrate the finishing of the railroad, and Villard, the president of the railroad, is going to come through. When I was reading it, I got all excited. It took me weeks to get to the point where the railroad finally came through, and as it turned out, it ended up being a bust occasion because they came through at 2 in the morning and everybody was asleep. But Bryant, my husband, who's here, will remember that I would get so excited. I'd say, today's the day the railroad's coming through. So another reason that people enjoy reading the paper and do kind of for fun is looking at advertisements. This is one that appears regularly in the Puget Sound Dispatch, which is a newspaper that I'm currently indexing from 1872. A lot of ads have to do with medicine. Unlike articles, which never have pictures in them, advertisements often have beautiful images and sometimes fun images to look at. I recently attended a lecture that Olympia Historical Society had sponsored. A woman is writing a novel about a young boy who lived here, another boy who lived here in Olympia. And in order to paint the picture of what the town was like in the 1850s, she basically read advertisements from the Pioneer and Democrat because it just gives you such a vivid idea of day-to-day life in those times. Unfortunately, or for whatever reason, we as indexers don't index advertisements. But I like reading them anyway because they're just so much fun to read. And this gets to my story. One day about 4.5 years ago, I ran across this advertisement. And I don't know if you can all read it. I'll read at least parts of it. It says, "Caution, I hereby caution all persons from harboring a boy by the name of John Schneider. Said boy is about 5 feet high, eyes dark, hair brown, and of German parentage. As said boy had been legally and lawfully bound to me by his parents, and as I have brought him to this country and raised him as one of my family, I hereby give notice that I will prosecute any and all persons that may unlawfully keep said boy away from my house. Signed, Conrad Schneider, Olympia, Washington Territory, March 19, 1858. So, in reading this advertisement, I had a couple of questions, and some might occur to you as well. First, what does the word bound mean? He was a servant. He was an indentured, probably an indentured servant to this person, Conrad Schneider, and a young boy. So he may have come out here and promised to work for a certain number of years in exchange for learning a trade. But what else strikes you about this ad?
It doesn't say how old he is.
Doesn't say how old he is. Probably young because he's short. But they have the same last name. So I wondered, okay, are these two related? And if they're related, why is John Schneider bound to Conrad Schneider? What's going on? Well, the mystery deepened when in the next week that I was indexing, I ran across an article relaying accounts of the district court proceedings here in Olympia. And I found this little blurb: true bills were found by the grand jury against Conrad Schneider and John Schneider for larceny, but were discharged on motion of the prosecuting attorney. So here's these same people appearing. The first time Conrad Schneider is looking for this apparent runaway servant or relative of some sort. And in the very next week, we find that they've been apparently accused of larceny acting together. Well, then the following week, an unprecedented event occurred, and that is a correction was issued by the Pioneer and Democrat. This is the only time in all the years that I cataloged the Pioneer and Democrat where a correction was actually issued. And unlike today where, they issue corrections for, this person was on the left instead of on the right of the picture. Well, and so in this correction, the editor noted that he had made a mistake, that in fact, yes, they may have been accused of larceny, but the grand jury, in fact, had found not a true bill. In other words, they hadn't found that there was any evidence enough to at least even charge Conrad and John Schneider. And he noted at the very end, Mr. Schneider is regarded by our community generally as an industrious and honorable man. The error was made by ourself from oppressive business at the time. Now, fast forward a couple more weeks, and here's another ad. This one says, notice John Schneider, S-N-Y-D-E-R, bound to the subscriber according to law by the probate court of the county of Thurston, left my house on Thursday, the 14th July. He speaks good English, is about 5 feet high, light complexion and light hair, had on when he left, etc., etc. All persons are forbid harboring him. And then it's signed George Lutz on the new road 7 miles from Olympia. So question, is John Schneider the same as John Schneider? Why is John Schneider's running away one year and then he's running away from somebody else the following year? Who the heck is George Lutz if John Schneider, the same person, was bound over to him? So at that point, like Alice in the rabbit hole, I was hooked into this story, and I decided I needed to find out what the heck was going on here. And the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about the research that I did. And I'm just going to have to say that when I tell people about my book, they usually have 1 or 2 questions about the Schneider family and the history, but mostly they ask me, are you related to the Schneiders? And how did you find out about the story? And what happened to you during the research? So I thought I'd share a little bit with you about the process of research and maybe get some ideas from you as well as we go along. So the first thing I did, of course, in doing this research was go to the internet and Google Conrad Schneider. And what came up was the obituary of one of the great-grandchildren of Conrad Schneider named Don Schneider. Listed, of course, his widow and surviving children. And I screwed up my courage, and I called up Millie Schneider and asked her what she could tell me about Conrad. She said, well, I'm the second wife. I really can't tell you anything about him, but I'll tell his daughter, Fran, to call you. Well, within 5 minutes, Fran had called me and said, we've been waiting for somebody to tell Conrad's story, and we're so glad that you called. Now, by this time, I had already had an image in my mind of Conrad as this kind of a stern, mean guy who had taken advantage of this poor little boy, and so I was kind of having mixed feelings about how I was going to deal with the family and so forth. Well, I shouldn't have been worried. The family had been just supportive all along. And so for my first lesson was overcome your shyness and just give people a call. And here's some of the wonderful, wonderful people and friends that I made in the course of this project, and some of them are here today. Judy Hambrick, who's Malkina Schneider's great-granddaughter, and Ron Seacrest, who's Conrad's great-grandson. So we've got 2 generations of Schneiders represented here. And these events that are pictured here have to do with commemoration of the New Dungeness lighthouse that it turned out Conrad Schneider was the chief mason for. Ron here is holding a brick that Conrad Schneider probably fired either here or up near the New Dungeness lighthouse and had fallen off of the lighthouse way, way back in the early part of the 20th century. And during these times that we've gotten together, there have been any number of damp eyes and moving events, and it's just been a wonderful experience for me and hopefully for them. And through the family, I got access to some materials that I never would have been able to get through regular research. This was a memoir that was written by Don Schneider called My Great-Great-Grandfather. And it tells a lot of anecdotes about his, it was actually his great-grandfather, and gave me some really basic background about the Schneider family and about Conrad and Albertina Schneider. One of the most moving items that came my way was provided by Ron. It was Albertina Schneider, née Mansdotter's Bible that she had brought across with her from Sweden when she immigrated here as a young teenager. And just having that document in my, or the book in my hands just really gave me shivers because it brought Albertina to life for me. And one of the moving aspects of her having this Bible and having kept it is that Albertina was illiterate. So she had this Bible, she was confirmed, but never had an opportunity to read it. The second lesson that I learned early on is to be flexible about spelling, especially if somebody has a name that people don't know how to pronounce. So I've seen Conrad spelled at least 3 different ways, Schneider pronounced at least 4 different ways, Lotz, who we'll get to in a minute, spelled at least 3 different ways, and Albertina spelled at least 2 ways. I like the alternate spelling of Albertina in particular because I see this alternate spelling Albedina in places where she would have had to tell somebody out loud what her name was. When the census taker came around and when she had to be taken separately to say that signing away some property rights was her own free will. And at that point, her name is spelled Albedina, and that gave me the idea that that's probably how she spelled her own name, or how she pronounced her own name. And so that's how I think of her, as actually Albedina. Of course, there's tons of internet resources that I consulted. Ancestry.com is a favorite of mine because you can see actual documents, census documents, and so forth. But one of the things that Ancestry.com really does that's a wonderful resource is if you have a name of somebody in your Ancestry.com page, whether or not it's made public, my page for Conrad Schneider isn't public, but people can see his name, and they'll contact me. So I've met all kinds of relatives and descendants of the Schneider family just by people contacting me from all over the country and asking me how I know, about Albertina and so forth. Secretary of State, of course, has great resources. The Digital Archives, Bureau of Land Management will give you information about donation claims and homestead claims. Online books are great. Google now has a project where you can look for the name of a book, and many, many thousands of documents are available. Books are available completely online, so you don't have to, I shouldn't say this, but you don't have to read the whole book. You can just search for one name and get quick access to what you're looking for. And this Thurston County Pioneer Project in particular is one that I really enjoyed finding out about. Back in the early part of the 20th century, descendants of pioneers or pioneers themselves were invited to fill out a form and send them in about themselves and their pioneer experience or their parent. This one is Conrad's. It was filled out by his oldest son, Henry. I actually have copies of some of this up here if you want to look at it later. and gives the names of all of his children, where he came from, who he was married to, and so forth. And here is a line 17, companions and party, and here we see the name Lutz, L-U-T-Z. So here's kind of the second, or the first clue I had that there was a relationship between Conrad Schneider and Lutz, or Lotz, or however you want to spell it. So more internet resources are the Olympia Historical Society website. I'm very actively involved in that. On the statewide level, historylink.org, Genealogical Society, Washington State Historical Society, and of course all of our local organizations have their own websites. A number of them have history pages. On good old paper and microfiche, there's the Timberland Regional Library, Washington State Library, which we were so fortunate to live in this community to be able to access. And the Washington State Archives, same thing. It's right down the street here, and it's an amazing resource for just about anything you can imagine, with a wonderful staff that generally are very enthusiastic about helping you. There's all kinds of books about Olympia. One of them, two of them, or three of them at least, written or co-written by Shanna. And they're good overall resources for history. Because Conrad Schneider was not famous, was fairly obscure, in fact, there's not very much about Conrad Schneider in any of these books, although every once in a while you'll find his name appearing in an index with a line, Conrad Schneider did this or that, and then you just follow up and try to figure out what happened. In a compilation of articles about Tumwater that Gail Palmer put together and Shanna contributed to as well, I found at the very, very bottom, these are the donation claims in the Tumwater area that were filed back in the 1850s. At the very, very bottom, I found George Lotz and Conrad Schneider. So again, here's confirmation number 2 that there was probably some kind of relationship between George Lotz and Conrad Schneider, and I was able finally to find out exactly where it was that they had their first donation claim. So lesson number 1 is don't be shy. Lesson number 2, start looking in all the resources you have, and be flexible about spelling. Next lesson is tenacity pays off. I discovered at the Washington State Library that there's volumes and volumes that list every single ship that came in, every single immigration ship that came in for 150 years, and it's very well indexed. And so I started looking for, I was particularly looking for George Lotz and how he might have been related to Conrad Schneider. Well, so I eventually found that there are a few George Lotzes and there's lots and lots of Schneiders. But I found one ship that arrived in New Orleans on New Year's Eve of 1851. And this is a passenger list. And this is a great resource. So up there, the first highlighted line is George Schneider. He came from a town called Felsberg in Germany. And he was married to Gertrude Schneider. And here's all his children. The first one at the top there is Johannes, i.e. John. And this John Schneider is exactly the same age as the John Schneider that I was looking for. And then right below that, there's another child named Conrad Schneider. So I'm starting to be pretty sure that, that this George Schneider might have been a relative, a brother perhaps, of my Conrad Schneider. And a bunch of other kids. You know, back in those days, people had kids every 2 years, so they're all stair-step down. They're all listed as musicians, even the baby. There's a baby who's like just a few months old, and he's ditto musician in that family. Which was, you know, there were German bands, family bands, all throughout Germany, and then as they came here, there were German family bands. And so it's very possible that it's a whole family of musicians. And then right below that, there's George Lotz, L-O-T-Z, and he's also from Phillipsburg. So at that point, I thought, bingo, here's a relationship probably between the Lotz family and the Schneiders family that goes all the way back to Germany. I wasn't 100% sure. And in the meantime, I had been badgering the Historical Society of Des Moines, Iowa, for information about Conrad Schneider's time in Burlington, Iowa, because I had discovered that he had spent time in Burlington, Iowa before he came here. Finally, after months, I got this document from them, which is a marriage certificate, or a record of a marriage certificate for Conrad and Albertina Schneider. And this was where I just jumped out of my seat when I saw this. Conrad Schneider from Phillipsburg. So that was my final clue that George Schneider, George Lotz, and Conrad Schneider were almost certainly relatives, and that George Lotz was either a relative or a close friend. And then finally, there's the element of serendipity that all researchers find. Sooner or later, you run across something you didn't expect. There's a 3-volume series of memoirs or submissions that the WPA put together during the Depression called Told by the Pioneers. What happened was people, historians or researchers, went out into all over Washington State and asked pioneers for their reminiscences. And I was just kind of paging through it idly because I knew there wasn't, Conrad Schneider hadn't appeared and George Lotz hadn't appeared, and so I just thought I'd just look through it and see what else was there. And I ran across Elizabeth Lotz Treat Longmire's submission listed as from Yakima County. But when I started reading it, I realized that this was the daughter of George Lotz, and she ends up telling exactly how the Schneiders and the Lotzes were related. Confirmed some stories that I'd heard from the Schneider side, but I had never heard from the Lotz side about the pioneer experience when they came across on the Oregon Trail, and painted a wonderful picture of what their lives were like when they were living out on Bush Prairie where they first moved. So what she confirmed was, in fact, that Conrad, now let's see, I got to get this straight here. Conrad's brother, George Schneider, was married to George Lotz's sister. So Conrad and George were, I don't know whether you call this relationship brothers-in-law or not, because they were each related to people who were married to each other. But that's where the relationship was established. And from then, I concluded that probably John Schneider was that Johannes Schneider, son of George, who was brought out then by Conrad Schneider just before the lighthouse was begun. Now, that's just one little piece of all the various puzzles that I tried to solve when I was researching this book. And it's just, I just put it up here as an illustration of all the various ways that you can find things and all the puzzles that you can solve or not solve. And so my final lesson is not to lose heart. Aside from the family, the Schneider family isn't well known. There's not books written about them. Everybody knows about Schneiders Creek and Schneiders Prairie, but most people don't know where those names came from. I went to a lecture when I was first starting this project by Drew Crooks, a local historian, and one of the things he pointed out is there's lots and lots of people, 500, who lived just in the Olympia area, and maybe 1,000 who lived in the greater area. And only a handful have had books or even articles written about them. There's just tons of families out there whose stories are waiting to be told. And everybody, particularly in that area, does have a fascinating story to tell. I believe that a number of those families are ones who came from ethnic communities. Maybe their English wasn't as good, or maybe they didn't have the opportunity to become elected to being judge or sheriff or auditor. So we've got members that I know from the 1850s and 1860s, from German, Scandinavian, Chinese, certainly Native Americans and black backgrounds that have not, whose stories haven't been told. And they're great stories, and it's a challenge, but it's not impossible to find them. And I look forward to hearing all of your stories about your backgrounds and relatives and adding to our rich history. So with that, I would love to hear either observations or questions from you before I go to my next job, which is signing books. Got Pat.
Hi. Yeah.
Hi.
My daughter and I both really love the book, and maybe everybody else loves it. Where is Bush Prairie, Schneider Prairie, and the river that we built the bridge over to get to Olympia?
Okay, so Bush Prairie, let's see, go back here. Whoops. This picture will show you a little bit about where Bush Prairie was. The airport is, sort of in the upper third of this particular map. So Bush Prairie really covers the area where the airport is now, and where George and Conrad lived is at the intersection now of I-5 and 93, so 93rd Street. So where the American campground is, there on 93rd, is on Conrad Schneider's donation claim. Schneider's Prairie is off of 101. If you go up 101 and take Steamboat Island Road, that whole area where Steamboat Island Road comes off is Schneider's Prairie, although a very small amount of it is still prairie.
Not where the metal animals, cows are.
No, but that was Schneider property at one time, but Schneider's Prairie is a little bit further on beyond that. And there's folks here who grew up or lived here. Griffin School, yeah, would be a good highlight, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And how about the river? What river did they build the bridge on?
Oh, they built a bridge over the Deschutes River, where, right where the Olympia Brewery is. They assisted in building the first bridge, which connected the families of Bush Prairie, of Tumwater, to the markets in Olympia. Before then, you had to cross over. You could try to persuade an Indian to cross you over. Yeah.
You said they're putting the newspaper collection in the Washington State Library online.
Yeah.
How is the projected cuts to the library going to be impacted? Going to impact that?
What's happened is the State Library has laid off 30 people. Among them, some folks from that indexing project. But staff have been reassigned, so the indexing is still going on. I'm still going up there every week as a volunteer. It may slow down the scanning process. And in addition, the entire restoration program at the State Library has been eliminated, at least for the time being. So I anticipate it'll slow the process down, but it is still going on. Indexing is still going on for sure.
So is there an index online now?
Yes, a number of newspapers are already online. If you go to the Secretary of State website, it's not easy to find, but you will go into the Washington history area, and then you'll see search historic newspapers and click on that. And it's once you get to the historic newspapers section, it's very, very easy to find what newspapers are up there and be able to search by personal names or anything. Any other questions or comments? Shanna?
Can you just talk a little bit about how you used the research then, and then how you created the book from the research?
Sure, yeah, thanks. At some point along the course of my research, I realized that not every big question was going to be answered. The question about the theft, for example, which I've avoided answering here. I found out something about it, but I didn't ever find a complete answer. And so I decided, once I decided I was going to start writing about this family, at some point I decided I was going to write it as a novel instead of as a biography. It seemed to me to be easier to read if I was providing the narrative and I was providing my idea of what happened, rather than having a series of, we can speculate that, da-da-da, or we can speculate blah, blah, blah. And so, but I also decided to be very, very rigorous about not making anything up that I didn't have to, not changing any known facts, which was a good discipline for me because as I went along every week, I would have an idea of what I thought was going on, and then the following week I would discover it was entirely wrong. So sticking to the facts was a good discipline for me. And I also made the decision then at the end of the novel, there's a section which describes what I made up and what I didn't make up. And other researchers can draw their own conclusions about what they think might have happened as an alternative narrative.
Did I hear you're working on another book?
I am. I'm working on a sequel which will be based on the lives of the next generation. So I'm trying to do a lot of research now on the Schneiders, Prairie, and Mud Bay area to fill in some of those gaps.
One more question, since I do a women's history program. Can you talk a little bit about women's history in your book?
What I can say about women's history is that it's very difficult to do. First of all, women change their names, which maybe they shouldn't be allowed to do because they are so hard to find when they change their names and move in, and you can never tell, is that the same person unless you find a marriage certificate. They also weren't as prominent in the community. If they owned property, usually it was only by virtue of being married to their husbands. And with the exception of a few women, I think many women, at least way back here, really were content to let their husbands, or at least they had to let their husbands be the spokesperson for their family. So I did try very hard to tell Albertina's story, and Albertina is a big part of this book, her story of coming over from Sweden, her marriage, and raising children. But I have to say that a lot of it I had to put together from other women's stories. What's it like when you're 5 months pregnant and you're on the Oregon Trail and you're walking on the Oregon Trail and you have to wear a dress? What's it like when you're slogging through the mud from Longview up to Olympia, waist high or knee high, and you're 6 months pregnant? Painting that picture is something that we have to reconstruct because there aren't nearly as many narratives, I find, from women as there are from men. And maybe you can add to that, Shanna.
I think that you make great points there.
Yeah.
Could I ask how long ago you finished this book and who published it and what your audience was when you were writing this? What were you considering to be your audience?
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question. Let's see, how long ago did I start writing the book?
Did you finish?
Oh, how long ago did I finish it? Who published it? And who's my audience? I finished, well, it came out in late November, and there was a book launching party in early December. It's published by a print-on-demand company called Ex Libris, which allows me or Amazon or whoever to order copies as people want to buy them, but they look like regular books. This is what the paperback looks like. I struggled with the intended audience. At one point I thought it would be for young adults, but as there are some main characters who aren't young adults, it seemed like it was more appropriate to target it to a general audience. But certainly people who are interested in local history are going to be the primary audience for the book. All right. Yes?
When you talked about the marginalized communities and trying to tell the stories for these other unknown citizens, I think you use, would you say that you follow those same sorts of standards in doing the research? Is it still Ancestry.com? Is it that same process, or are there a couple of things that need to be different?
Because I was writing about a largely unknown family, I found that these resources that I've talked about were very, very useful because everybody's required to file certain documents with their tax authority or whatever, and so you're always going to find. I shouldn't say always. I'd say there are some communities, for example, Native American communities and possibly some other Chinese community, for example, where for example, the census taker barely bothered to figure out what their names were. And so that's going to be a lot more challenging than somebody who's a Euro-American, who at least, you can kind of try to figure out how you're going to spell Schneider, and it's easier for somebody to find their name. But yeah, I imagine there's some communities where it's going to be much, much harder. Woman is researching a story about an escaped slave who lived here, and she has a hard time finding any kind of documents about even his existence, except for the fact that he escaped and was in the newspaper for that reason. Okay, yeah, thank you very much.